June 10, 1943. Somewhere along the east coast of the United States, dawn broke over an airfield still heavy with fog. Engines coughed in the distance, echoing through the mist, while ground crews moved like ghosts, silent, precise, rehearsed. They were preparing a machine that would change the war. But no one outside this base knew it yet, and those who thought they did were wrong. By mid-morning, a single telegram would cross the Atlantic, encrypted in German ciphers, stamped with authority from Berlin. It carried what appeared to be a breakthrough, a complete technical report on the new American fighter, its weaknesses, its design flaws, its supposed limitations. It was, by all accounts, the kind of intelligence that could shift the balance of the air war over Europe. It was also a lie. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because this is the untold story of the German spy who mocked the P-51 Mustang, and the American counterintelligence scheme that led him. The spy's name was not remarkable at first glance. He was a man trained in the quiet art of deception, fluent in English, educated, disciplined. To his handlers he was known by his code name, Seahorse. To American counterintelligence he would soon become one of the most valuable assets they never planned to have. In 1942, as Allied and Axis powers wrestled for control of the skies, German intelligence, Abwehr, faced a frustrating reality. Their networks in Britain and America were crumbling. Agents were being caught, turned, or fed false trails. Still, Berlin demanded results. They wanted data, blueprints, prototypes, anything that could explain how the Allies were preparing to outfly the Luftwaffe. For the Reich's Air Ministry, one rumor stood out. A new American fighter, fast, long-range, and built for escort missions, was being tested in secret. The code whispered through intercepted radio chatter, Mustang. In late 1942, Abwehr approved a desperate plan. An operative already embedded in the United States would be tasked with infiltrating air industry circles and retrieving any possible information about this Mustang project. His mission was simple: learn everything and report directly to Berlin. But what Seahorse didn't know was that the Americans were listening too. By that winter, the Office of Strategic Services and the FBI Special Intelligence Service had begun quietly dismantling a number of German spy rings operating inside the U.S. One by one, radio operators, couriers, and field agents disappeared. Those who didn't vanish were turned, flipped through interrogation or the illusion of safety. In Washington, a small group within the OSS proposed something radical. Instead of merely catching spies, they would feed them. Controlled deception. It was a game the British had already mastered through their double-cross system. Now, the Americans would try their own version. The bait was simple: carefully curated leaks about aircraft under development. Each piece of information was plausible, technical, and timed perfectly with real-world rumors. To the Germans it looked like intelligence gold. In reality, it was a carefully woven illusion. The goal wasn't just to confuse enemy engineers. It was psychological, to shape belief itself, to make the Luftwaffe underestimate what was coming. By spring 1943, Seahorse had successfully delivered his first reports on the P-51 program. He described the aircraft as lightly built, underpowered, and unsuitable for high-altitude combat. Berlin received the news with smug satisfaction. The report confirmed what they already wanted to believe: that America's aircraft industry was inefficient, its technology second-rate, and its pilots inexperienced. For the Reich's propaganda machine, this was perfect. In confidential briefings, Luftwaffe officers laughed at the Mustang. They called it a toy plane, a farmhand's fighter. One colonel even joked that the Americans would do better mounting rifles on tractors. Arrogance, born not of truth but of design. The Americans watched all of it unfold. Intercepted radio traffic from Europe mirrored their intended deception perfectly. The German High Command was not only convinced, they were spreading the disinformation themselves. For American intelligence, this was victory in slow motion. At Wright Field in Ohio, engineers and test pilots were finishing the final configurations of the P-51B, a new variant equipped with the British Merlin engine. Its sleek frame now screamed through the air at over 440 miles per hour, able to climb higher and fly farther than anything the Luftwaffe had in service. Yet across the ocean, German intelligence memos still labeled it experimental, unfit for prolonged missions. The deception had worked so thoroughly that Luftwaffe strategists deprioritized countermeasures against long-range escort fighters. Their own pilots were briefed with outdated intelligence, believing the P-51 would never reach Berlin, let alone dominate its skies. The irony was surgical. By the time the truth arrived, it would already be wrapped in fire. In every war there are weapons made of steel and fuel, and others forged entirely from belief. This was one of the latter. The OSS called it Operation Mockbird, an informal name whispered only in passing, never documented officially. Its architects, analysts, linguists, and former journalists understood that the most effective lie was one that affirmed an enemy's pride. Feed them what they want to hear and they'll build the prison themselves. Seahorse continued transmitting from a small rented apartment outside Philadelphia. His reports were confident, detailed, and wrong in all the right places. He even included fake complaints from American test pilots about instability and overheating at high speeds, issues that had long since been solved. Each message, encrypted in Enigma code, was received by German command and summarized for Göring himself. The Luftwaffe chief's arrogance was already legend. To him, the very idea that American engineering could rival German precision was absurd. "The Yankees can't outfly us," he once told his staff. "They build refrigerators, not fighters." Those words would age poorly. Meanwhile, in hangars filled with the scent of gasoline and new paint, young American pilots climbed into their Mustangs for the first time. Many were barely 20. They had no idea that half the battle had already been fought in secret, with typewriters and radio waves instead of bullets. For them, the aircraft spoke for itself. It was fast, balanced, and beautiful. The P-51 didn't just fly, it hunted. And when it dived, it didn't sing like the Spitfire or roar like the Thunderbolt. It whispered. A whisper that would soon become the last sound many German pilots would ever hear. But the game wasn't over yet. The Americans had one more move to make. To keep the deception alive, they would have to risk exposure. So they sent Seahorse another packet, this time containing what appeared to be blueprints for a variant of the Mustang fitted with experimental armaments. It was nonsense, of course. But it was believable nonsense. Berlin's engineers spent months analyzing it. They concluded, wrongly, that the P-51 structural design could not support heavier firepower without compromising stability. As a result, the Luftwaffe deprioritized armor improvements for its own bombers, assuming they were already safe from heavy American escorts. The trap was complete. By the time the first Mustangs escorted B-17s deep into Germany, the skies had already been rigged with overconfidence. And then reality arrived. December 1943. Over Bremen, the German air defense system detected a formation approaching from the west. At first, radar operators assumed they were standard bombers returning from a raid. But as the dots drew closer, they noticed something strange. Fighter escorts, dozens of them, flying far deeper than expected. The alarm sounded too late. German pilots scrambled, expecting slow, short-range planes. Instead, they met a wall of silver ghosts. P-51s. Fast, agile, merciless. In less than 20 minutes, Luftwaffe losses shattered expectations. By nightfall, reports from surviving pilots reached command. "These are not the same Mustangs. They climb like devils. They don't run out of fuel. They chase us home." Göring, when told of the encounter, refused to believe it. He demanded verification, certain it was a trick. But it wasn't a trick. It was the truth finally catching up. By the time Berlin realized what had happened, the lie had done its job. Thousands of German pilots would enter combat under false assumptions, trained on outdated tactics, facing machines they had been taught to laugh at. The laughter ended quickly. As Allied air dominance expanded through 1944, the P-51 Mustang became a symbol not just of power, but of deception's quiet genius. A plane born from collaboration, perfected in secrecy, and unleashed under the shadow of a lie. And somewhere in a cell, under American custody, the man who mocked it would sit in silence, wondering how much of what he'd ever known had been true. Under interrogation, the man known as Seahorse did not break easily. He sat at a metal table, his wrists loosely bound, his face pale under the single hanging light. He had believed himself untouchable, a servant of the Reich who had outwitted the Americans. What he didn't know was that his greatest triumph had been scripted for him. His own pride had written the lines. The agents across the table spoke softly, asking about his radio frequencies, his contacts, the details of his transmissions. They never raised their voices, never struck him. They didn't need to. The silence between questions was enough. For the first time in years, the spy realized that silence could be more dangerous than any weapon. In that silence, he could hear the echo of his mistakes. He tried to explain that he had delivered valuable intelligence, that he had crippled American aircraft development by exposing their flaws. One of the interrogators, a young officer with the calm of someone who already knew the ending, leaned forward and said, "You did your job well. Better than we could have hoped." The words confused him. He frowned, searching for meaning. Then the officer slid a small folder across the table. Inside were carbon copies of his own transmissions, typed, decoded, and annotated in English long before they had ever reached Berlin. The truth sank in slowly. They had let him do it. Every message, every report, every coded phrase he believed was secret had been written, edited, and sent under their watch. He had not deceived them. They had deceived him. The room seemed to shrink around him. The air grew heavy. His mouth went dry. He whispered something in German, half denial, half prayer, but the words fell apart before they reached his lips. In Washington, the success of the operation was celebrated quietly. There were no parades, no headlines. Only a memo circulated between departments, confirming that the deception had achieved its objective. The enemy's underestimation of the P-51 Mustang was complete. American command decided that the operation would never be officially acknowledged. Some victories were safer in the dark. While the spy awaited trial, the Mustang's legend began to rise across the European front. Pilots spoke of it in reverent tones, like a creature born for the sky. They said it could fly farther than any escort, fight longer than any adversary, and return home with fuel to spare. To the bomber crews who had once faced waves of German interceptors, the sight of those silver wings above them was like divine intervention. But behind every flight, there was still the shadow of the lie. The men who had built the deception knew its power. They also knew its danger. For every falsehood that shaped victory, another might be born to justify it. As the air war intensified, the Germans tried to adapt. They reintroduced the FW-190D, improved the Bf-109, and pushed jet development with the Me-262. But they were running out of time. The Allied bombing campaign crippled fuel supplies and disrupted production lines. The Luftwaffe's once immense power had become a ghost of itself, struggling to rise each morning. And in the skies above, the P-51s ruled unchallenged. In early 1944, when the first squadrons of Mustangs escorted bombers all the way to Berlin, even the most optimistic German commanders could no longer deny what had happened. The intelligence reports had been wrong. Fatally wrong. Among pilots, the story spread like wildfire. The Americans tricked us, some whispered. They built a machine we never saw coming. Others blamed arrogance, bureaucracy, or fate. But among the older officers, those who had once mocked the Mustang, the silence was heavier. They remembered the briefings, the laughter, the dismissal. They remembered believing they were invincible. Pride had made them blind. Inside the war rooms of Berlin, the realization came too late. Maps covered with red pins told the story in silence. Every new raid reached deeper into the Reich. Every countermeasure failed faster than the one before. The deception had not just fooled their intelligence network, it had shaped their entire strategy. In his private office, Hermann Göring read the latest reports with disbelief. His once mighty Luftwaffe was collapsing, its air superiority gone. He called in his aides and demanded to know how American aircraft could possibly reach so far. "It's impossible," he muttered. "They told me it was impossible." No one answered. The silence itself was an answer. By summer, the P-51 had become the symbol of an approaching end. Its long silver fuselage gleamed against the blue sky like a blade catching sunlight. For German pilots, its silhouette meant death. For the Allies it meant hope. But in the ruins of that hope lay something darker, a lesson written not in victories but in illusions. The lie that destroyed an empire's faith in its own power had also reminded the world of a truth it would never forget. Belief, once corrupted, can be as lethal as any bomb. In a military prison outside Washington, the man once called Seahorse sat alone, awaiting transfer. He had been offered no trial date, no assurances. His name was already erased from official files. Some said he was sent back to Germany under a false identity after the war, others that he disappeared into the same silence he once served. What remains certain is this: his deception, the one he believed he had crafted, became part of a greater deception that shaped history. His arrogance was not unique. It was shared by an entire system that could not imagine being wrong. The American officers who orchestrated the plan understood the irony. They had won a war not just with firepower but with imagination. And yet, as they watched the destruction that followed, they also understood what their victory had cost. The weapon of deception once used could never be unseen. Even in peace, nations would continue to lie, to enemies, to allies, to themselves. The illusion of control had proven too seductive. As the final days of the war approached, Allied pilots roamed the skies with impunity. They strafed convoys, destroyed supply lines, and escorted bombers that reduced German cities to ash. In those missions, the Mustang became a legend, its roar echoing over ruined cathedrals and burned-out rail yards. But for the few who knew the full story, each flight carried a quiet shadow. Somewhere beneath those wings lay the ghost of a man who once believed he understood the enemy. Somewhere in the archives of Washington, a folder marked declassified held his false reports, preserved as a reminder of what belief can do when it becomes a weapon. And though the world moved on, the principle endured. Every intelligence officer, every strategist, every pilot who studied the war would learn the same silent truth. In the theater of war, deception is both the sword and the mirror. It cuts both ways. When the P-51s finally returned home, their paint faded and their engines tired, they were hailed as heroes. But their greatest victory had been fought long before their first mission. On the night a man sent a message he thought would win the war for his country. Instead, it ended it. The story of the German spy who mocked the Mustang is not just about espionage or airplanes. It is about the quiet arrogance that blinds nations, the illusion of superiority that crumbles under truth. It is about how even the smallest lie, when believed by the powerful, can rewrite the fate of millions. And so, as we look back 80 years later, we remember the Mustang not only for its wings of steel, but for the invisible wings of deception that carried it into legend. Because in the end, history does not forgive arrogance, it exposes it. And the echo of that lesson still flies above us, somewhere between pride and ruin, between truth and the silence that follows. In the years that followed, the name Mustang carried a weight that few machines ever could. To most of the world, it became a symbol of liberation, a silver spear that pierced the heart of tyranny. But to those inside the hidden chambers of intelligence, the men and women who had written the lie that fooled an empire, it was something else entirely. It was proof that war could be won not only with strength but with narrative. After the war, the documents of Operation Mockbird were locked away under classification. Many of those involved never spoke of it again. Their careers moved quietly through the early Cold War, absorbed into the growing shadows of the new intelligence world. Yet among themselves, when they spoke in whispers over whiskey or cigarettes, they remembered how close the deception had come to turning on them. There had been a moment, during 1943, when the lie almost collapsed. A low-level clerk in Berlin had questioned the data's accuracy. He had noticed inconsistencies in the flight range figures, discrepancies between different reports. His memo, modest and buried in the paperwork, briefly reached the desk of a Luftwaffe technical officer. For a few days, the truth hovered dangerously close to discovery. But the officer, pressured by time and politics, dismissed it. He wrote, "The Americans exaggerate. The Mustang remains a secondary design. No threat." That single line sealed the fate of thousands. The irony was bitter. One man's arrogance became another man's opportunity. In the American archives, decades later, a declassified transcript revealed the calm precision with which the deception was managed. Each leak was timed to coincide with real events. An airfield test, a patent filing, a public mention in a trade journal. The false data wasn't random, it was engineered to blend truth with illusion until even the experts couldn't tell them apart. The brilliance of the plan wasn't in what it hid, but in what it allowed the enemy to see. A mirror, not a wall. By 1945, as Allied forces closed in on Berlin, the air war was no longer a battle, it was an execution. P-51 Mustangs roamed the skies, cutting through clouds of black smoke, chasing the last remnants of the Luftwaffe. In the ruins below, civilians looked up and saw the silver wings glinting in the sun, unaware that these machines were not only weapons of war but of story. Each time a Mustang soared over a German city, it carried with it a piece of that unseen narrative, the belief that had blinded its enemies, the arrogance that had undone them. And yet, even victory carried its own quiet unease. Within the OSS, some officers began to question what they had done. They had proven that truth could be shaped like metal, molded to fit the needs of strategy. But what happens when that power no longer serves defense but ambition? What happens when nations begin to deceive not their enemies, but their own people? That question would linger long after the war ended. In 1947, as the OSS evolved into the newly formed CIA, many of those who had worked on Operation Mockbird found themselves recruited into a growing network of covert influence and psychological warfare. They understood deception better than anyone, and in the new Cold War, information itself became the battlefield. The tools they had used against the Nazis were now being repurposed for new enemies, some abroad, some within. The Mustang's shadow stretched farther than anyone had intended. Meanwhile, in post-war Germany, pilots who had survived the air battles of 1944 and 1945 struggled to reconcile their memories with the propaganda they'd once believed. In scattered interviews years later, they admitted that they had underestimated the Americans completely. One veteran recalled his first encounter. "We were told the Mustangs were slow. Then I saw one climb past me like I was standing still. I remember thinking, this cannot be happening. And then, it did." Those who lived carried that humiliation quietly. For many, it was the moment they realized the war was truly lost, not because of bombs or tanks but because they had believed a comforting lie. In that realization lay the true victory of the Mustang, not just in air superiority, but in the psychological collapse it inflicted. It broke the enemy's confidence before it broke their defenses. Back in the United States, the aircraft factories that once roared day and night fell silent. The war was over. The men who had built the Mustangs returned to ordinary lives. Engineers, mechanics, dreamers who had unknowingly created not only a weapon but a myth. The spy who had mocked their work was forgotten, buried beneath the tides of history. Yet somewhere in the official archives of both nations his name remained, crossed out, redacted but never erased. Because even in his failure he had revealed something about the nature of power. That power built on falsehood, no matter how strong, will always devour itself. The years turned to decades. Jet engines replaced propellers, missiles replaced machine guns, and satellites replaced spies. But the logic of deception, of shaping the enemy's perception, remained the same. The lessons of Operation Mockbird were studied, copied, and refined. The art of feeding the enemy the truth they wanted to hear became a foundation of modern intelligence. Every conflict that followed bore traces of it: the manipulation of morale, the orchestration of fear, the theater of information. The shadow that began with one lie about an airplane became the blueprint for the wars of the mind that defined the 20th century. And in that shadow, one question continued to haunt those who understood: can truth survive in a world where illusion wins wars? The P-51 Mustang, once dismissed as a failure, ended the war as a legend. But its greatest flight was never on the battlefield. It was in the unseen corridors of strategy and belief. It flew not just through the sky but through perception itself. When its pilots stood on the tarmac, watching the sunset blaze against its polished wings, few of them could have known how much of their victory had already been decided long before they took off. Long before the first engine turned, a lie had already cleared their path. And somewhere, far from the airfields and the glory, a single man sat in silence, understanding at last that the truth he had ignored was the very weapon that destroyed him. History remembers the Mustang as a machine of war. But beneath its aluminum skin lies something greater, a mirror reflecting the cost of human arrogance. The story of its deception is not just about spies and airplanes, it is about us. About how easily pride blinds the intelligent, and how deeply we crave to believe what flatters us. The P-51's legend was written by engineers, but its victory was written by storytellers. Those who understood that in the chaos of war, the mind is the first battlefield, and the heart is the last to surrender. And as the world changed, as nations rebuilt and skies grew quiet again, that lesson remained like a contrail across the horizon, fading but never gone. Because long after the smoke cleared, one truth endured: the lie that fooled a single man ended up fooling an empire. And the echo of that lie still whispers in every age where pride outweighs wisdom and certainty blinds truth. Decades later, historians would search through the archives, piecing together fragments of the deception. Pages yellowed with time revealed the cold precision of its architecture. Memos written in the language of bureaucracy, detached, emotionless. Phrases like psychological degradation of enemy morale and strategic misdirection via controlled intelligence flow appeared again and again. The men who wrote them had not considered themselves storytellers. They had considered themselves soldiers. Yet in their own way they had crafted a narrative stronger than any bomb. One report, declassified in the late 1970s, contained a chilling line. The operation's success depended upon one principle: the enemy's faith in their own superiority. The simplicity of it was haunting. It wasn't about creating new lies, it was about magnifying the ones already believed. They hadn't needed to convince the Germans that the P-51 was weak. They'd merely confirmed what arrogance had already whispered to them. The same report concluded with a quiet warning: the greatest danger of deception is to those who wield it, for they too may come to believe their own illusion. That sentence would prove prophetic. In the following decades, as America entered new conflicts, from Korea to Vietnam and beyond, the philosophy of controlled deception evolved into something far larger. Information itself became a weapon. The ghosts of the Mustang operation echoed through every psychological campaign, every press release designed to shape perception rather than convey truth. The boundaries between fact and strategy blurred. Somewhere, buried deep in the files of intelligence agencies, the lessons of that wartime scheme became doctrine. The phrase, perception management, entered the lexicon. Reality, once a fixed point, became negotiable. But not everyone forgot the moral cost. Among the post-war generation of pilots, engineers, and strategists, there were those who spoke with quiet reverence for the Mustang, not just as a machine but as a warning. They said that its wings had cut through the arrogance of an empire, but its shadow had shown what happens when truth itself becomes a tool. One of them was a former test pilot named Major Thomas Ellery. In a rare interview recorded in 1961, he spoke about his memories of the war. "The Mustang flew better than anything I ever touched," he said. "But I think what people forget is that its greatest fight wasn't in the air. It was in people's heads. The Germans didn't just lose to a plane, they lost to an idea they couldn't let go of. They believed we were weaker. They needed to. And we let them." He paused for a long moment before adding, "We proved that stories could kill. I've never been sure if that's something to be proud of." His words lingered like the last echo of an engine after takeoff, fading but impossible to forget. In post-war Germany, the archives of the Luftwaffe told their own quiet story. Reports from late 1943 onward reflected growing panic among officers who could no longer understand the enemy's capabilities. Technical analysts scribbled desperate revisions in the margins. Range estimate incorrect, enemy altitude advantage unconfirmed, possible misinterpretation of data. Every correction came too late. The battle had already been lost in the mind. For the few who survived those final years, the truth was unbearable. They had fought not just an enemy but a phantom, the reflection of their own certainty. The Mustang had become a mirror in the sky, showing them what arrogance looks like when it falls. And yet history moved on. The world rebuilt itself. The Mustang, once an instrument of deception, became a museum piece, a relic of a cleaner story. Children would gaze at it in hangars, their reflections glimmering on its polished aluminum, unaware that beneath the beauty lay an invisible scar. The plaque beneath it would tell them about horsepower, speed, and range, but not about the lie that gave it wings. Because that lie was not meant for textbooks. It was meant to stay buried, alive only in whispers and classified reports. Still, truth has a way of resurfacing even after decades. In the early 1990s, when the American archives began to open Cold War documents to the public, a historian named Charles Milton stumbled upon a file labeled Strategic Counterintelligence, Air Division. Inside, he found references to an unnamed German operative, a communications intercept project, and multiple memos referencing engine performance falsification. The deeper he dug, the clearer the outline became. A spy fed false data about the P-51. Milton published his findings years later in a quiet academic journal. Few noticed. But among those who did, a handful recognized its importance. One of them was a retired intelligence officer who sent him a letter. The letter contained only one line: "You found the edge of the shadow. The rest is still in it." That line captured the essence of the story, a truth that could never be fully illuminated because it had been born in darkness. Today, when historians speak of the P-51 Mustang, they mention its range, its engine, its role in escorting bombers to Berlin. They celebrate its design and its pilots. But somewhere between those facts lies another story, a quieter one, built not of metal and smoke, but of deception and belief. A story that reminds us that wars are fought as much in the imagination as in the sky. The spy who mocked the Mustang has no grave that anyone can visit. His real name, if it ever existed in records, has long been erased. Yet his presence lingers in every retelling of the war, not as a villain but as a warning, a man who became the embodiment of his nation's fatal flaw, the conviction that truth is whatever power declares it to be. That conviction still echoes through time. Every generation rediscovers it in new forms, political, military, digital. The weapons change, but the arrogance does not. In the end, perhaps that is why the story endures. Because the lie that blinded a nation once reminded the world of something simple and eternal, that pride, when left unchecked, builds its own enemies. And when the engines of the next war begin to roar, somewhere in the distance, the faint whisper of a Mustang will still be there, cutting through the noise, carrying a message older than flight itself. Arrogance will always believe it is in control, until the sky proves otherwise. In the late afternoon light of a quiet museum in Dayton, Ohio, the air was still. Dust floated in golden shafts between the wings of a restored P-51 Mustang. Its polished aluminum skin caught the sun like water. Visitors passed in silence, reading the placards, whispering to their children. To them it was just another relic of victory, a symbol of courage, of freedom, of technological triumph. But if you listen closely, the air around it still carried something else. Something older. A story. Not of glory but of illusion. Not of conquest but of consequence. Because every legend, no matter how heroic, leaves behind a shadow. And the shadow of the Mustang was not the roar of its engine or the smoke it trailed in battle. It was the whisper of the lie that gave it power. Beneath the museum floor, stored in a restricted archive, rested the remnants of that story. Fragments of telegrams, coded transmissions, faded photographs. The paper was brittle, the ink pale. On one page, a typewritten note read, "Maintain illusion. Continue transmission feed through operative seahorse until notified otherwise." The next line, written in pen by another hand, added quietly, "He believes everything." The lie had been complete. Historians who later examined the file struggled to find the boundary between strategy and morality. How much deception is justified in war? How far can truth be twisted before it loses all meaning? The answers were never clear. The Mustang had won its war, but it had also opened a door that would never close. After 1945, the architects of deception scattered into the machinery of peace. Some worked in intelligence, others in diplomacy, a few in the growing industry of mass communication. They carried with them the lessons of controlled narrative, the idea that perception could shape reality more effectively than violence. That lesson became the seed of an era where truth itself could be managed, packaged, and sold. And so, the story of the Mustang became something larger than war. It became a prophecy of the modern world. In classrooms and documentaries, the P-51 is often described in numbers: speed, range, altitude. But those who study history know that numbers never tell the whole truth. The Mustang's most dangerous quality wasn't its power, it was the faith it inspired, and the blindness it exploited. For the Germans, it represented the arrogance that doomed them. For the Americans, it represented the cunning that saved them. But for humanity, it revealed a truth more complex than either victory or defeat. Every belief, no matter how righteous, carries the seed of its own undoing. Every certainty can become a prison. In the post-war years, intelligence manuals quietly referenced the operation as a case study in strategic perception. It was considered a masterpiece of psychological warfare. Yet within those same pages, some officers had scribbled notes in the margins, warnings about the moral decay that follows when truth becomes a tool. "Once you begin to deceive the enemy," one wrote, "you learn to deceive yourself." That insight would haunt generations. During the Cold War, as superpowers battled through propaganda, espionage, and secrecy, echoes of the Mustang operation resurfaced in unexpected places. State-controlled narratives, disinformation campaigns, false leads, all of them bore traces of the same logic. The illusion of control through narrative. The manipulation of arrogance. The weaponization of belief. And yet, every deception carried its own invisible cost. The longer nations lived by illusion, the further they drifted from truth. Reality became flexible, molded by fear, pride, and convenience. The lesson that began with a single spy and a single airplane had evolved into the philosophy of a new age. But history, as it always does, began to fold in on itself. In 1969, as man stepped onto the moon, the P-51 sat forgotten in hangars and museums. Its story had faded into nostalgia. Yet in that moment of triumph, when humanity looked toward the stars, the same ancient pattern lingered. The belief that power could outpace humility, that mastery over the physical world meant mastery over truth. The same illusion that once blinded an empire now lived quietly in the dreams of progress. Decades later, when the archives of World War II were finally opened to the public, a handful of scholars tried to reconstruct the real story of the German spy who mocked the Mustang. Their conclusions were fragmentary, sometimes contradictory. But one detail appeared in every account: his last recorded words during interrogation. When confronted with evidence of the deception, he had whispered, "But I thought I was helping Germany." The interrogator replied, "You were." No other record explained what that meant. Perhaps it was meant as irony. Perhaps it was meant as pity. Or perhaps it was the final, quiet acknowledgement that every war, no matter how righteous, consumes its own illusions. By the time the last of the wartime generation had passed away, the story had become more myth than fact. But myths endure because they carry something we recognize, something true even when wrapped in lies. And this one carries a warning that outlives its time. Because arrogance is not bound by borders or eras. It lives in every system, every empire, every age that confuses knowledge with wisdom and certainty with truth. The Germans believed they could not lose because they were superior. The Americans believed they could not fall because they were right. Both, in their own way, were deceived. The Mustang's victory was real, but it was also fragile, built on faith, illusion, and the silence of those who understood too much. Even now, when its engines no longer roar, when its pilots are gone, and its enemies long buried, the echo remains. It speaks in the hum of history itself, a reminder that power without humility is a flight that always ends the same way. In the quiet of the museum, the lights dim as evening settles. The last visitors leave. The Mustang gleams faintly in the darkness, its propeller frozen mid-spin. Somewhere in that stillness, the ghost of a radio signal hums, faint and eternal, carrying a message across time. Believe carefully. Because even the brightest wings can cast the darkest shadow.